right, today we're talking all about effect send processing. And we're going to start with the Abbey Road method, which is a great way, an easy way to clean up a reverb. This way we can use a bigger reverb than we might normally get away with by just honing it in to just how we want it. And then we're going to take all that to the next level and show you a bunch of great tips and tricks on different ways that you can soup up your effect sends. And all of these techniques are designed to get the biggest bang for your buck. You know, a lot of times we have a really big, grandiose reverb and it sounds great in solo, but it's just too much in the mix. Same thing for delays. But there's a lot of great things that you can do and be able to use a lot more of them than you might otherwise. So let's dive on in and take a listen. All right, so our vocal is being sent to this effect send here in red, which is vocal reverb. And it's a really big hall reverb with a 3-second tail. And the reverb has a high pass and a low pass, but they're not engaged. So we're getting the full spectrum reverb here, and it's just way too big and grandiose. It sounds good in solo, but in the mix, it just washes it out. Whenever you're setting up an effect send with a reverb, you typically want the dry wet knob at 100%. So we don't want any dry vocal coming through this reverb. We want to totally wash it out. And then you use the fader on the effect send to kind of set your level. So again, let's take a listen to her with this giant reverb on in the mix. In solo? Yeah, it sounds really nice in solo, but it's way too much for the mix. So the Abbey Road method is basically EQing your reverb, and this works best if you do the EQ at the start of the chain before it hits the reverb. You can do this EQ after the reverb, but it works better if you do it before. And the idea here is pretty simple. It's a high pass and a low pass. And your great starting points is 600 hertz for your high pass and 10K for your low pass. Now, depending on your mix, you might get away with a gentler slope and let a little bit more of the low mids through. That all depends on your material. And same thing for the low pass. So take a listen to the reverb again with this EQ bypassed. And we'll turn the EQ on. So the reverb got a lot brighter because we removed so much of the lows and low mids out of the reverb that are unnecessary. So that right there alone really helps the mix. And it sounds brighter even though we're rolling off some of the highs. Rolling off the highs gets the vocal reverb out of the way of the reverb that you want on your cymbals and overheads and stuff. Now the next step is to add in a high mid dip. This one is set at 3.2K because what we're targeting here is the clarity range of the vocal. That way the vocal shines through in the enunciation region and isn't washed out by the reverb. So here's the vocal in the spectrum analyzer dry. The enunciation is right up here just above 3K. So that's where we want to remove a little bit more of the reverb to make room for the enunciation in her voice. So without that node. And with. And we could dial it down even further. Yeah, very nice. That's very helpful. And that is the extent of the Abbey Road method. That is just a way to clean up our reverb so we can use a bigger reverb and not have it wash out the mix so much. But as you can tell, if we pop this back in the mix, this reverb is simply still too big. So let's take this concept to the next level. Now, the next thing we want to do works good on other instruments, and it works good in guitar solos and stuff, but it's really good on a vocal. And that is to add a compressor after the reverb that is side-chained back to the vocal source. Now, in this case, you want to set up the compressor sidechain to go back to the original vocal in pre-fader. Pre-fader is going to be really important for this technique. So you can hear the reverb is ducking out of the way while she sings, and that is the yellow gain reduction line here set by the threshold. And when she's done singing, the reverb recovers and swells back up. And this is a classic reverb technique, and it's really, really helpful. And again, this gives us the ability to use a bigger reverb that's not washing her out and washing the mix out, and it just swells up and recovers when she's done singing. So here I have a ratio of in between 5 and 6 to 1, pretty strong. You clamp down the threshold depending on the material and how much gain reduction you want. And the attack is going to decide how much of a little burst of reverb gets to cut through right when she starts singing. Now, for a big, heavy rock song and a dense mix, you might want this set all the way as fast as it'll go. But I like to let a little bit of it through. Yeah, that's nice, at about 20 milliseconds. And the release controls how fast this swells back up when she's done singing. I have a pretty medium to slow release here. It's set at about 275. And it's a nice slow recovery of a swell there, but this also depends on tempo. But the release is how you dial that in. If you dial it too slow, it'll never recover and you'll kind of lose the effect altogether. Yeah, there's not much tail coming back up there because the release is too slow. If it's too fast and it recovers in a split second when she's done singing, it might sound a little unnatural. So I liked it where I had it, but again, this depends on tempo, and you typically want to dial these in the context of the mix, not in solo. The other really important thing here on the compressor in this technique is the mix knob. I have the mix set at 70, so while she's singing, it's letting in a little bit of the reverb. Now, if you do this 100% wet, you might need to readjust your threshold because there's a bit of an interplay between the threshold and the wet knob here, but here it is 100% wet. Yeah, and if we do too much, then she'll be too washed out while she's singing. This is a 50% mix. Yeah, so this is all just dependent on your mix and where you like it. And in this case, I got it set around 70%. Yeah, and another thing is the makeup gain. The makeup gain will add to how much the swell that recovers when she's done singing. Sometimes you don't want any, sometimes having a little bit is nice. If you crank this up, then you could really push the reverb up when she's done singing. Now, I like a little bit here. I got this set at about 4 dB for makeup gain, but a cool thing to think about here is that you can automate this control. You know, a lot of times we have like a big long throw delay or throw reverb on the vocal at the end of like the last line in a chorus where we want to hear a bunch more reverb or delay. And that's usually called a throw, and we do that with automation. So at the end of this line, you could automate the makeup to increase to push up the reverb. So that's just something to think about. Automating these controls can give you a little bit of sound design option on how you do this. But let's pop the mix back on now and take a listen to the reverb without the EQ and compressor. And EQ and compressor on. Yeah, that's very nice. Yeah, that way we get all the reverb that we want, but it's under control. It's not muddying up the low mids, and it's not too bright and shimmery in the high end, and the compressor is keeping it out of the way while she sings and letting it recover when she's done. So now we're bringing on a stereo ping pong delay, which is great for this mono vocal source. And this is going to bounce the reverb around in a stereo field and give it some more movement so we can add extra width and depth to the vocal. Yeah, and then I'll crank the mix knob way up so it's real obvious what it's doing here and it's too much. Yeah, awesome. I had it down here right around, I think 20%. Sounds pretty good. Yeah, so that's just pushing the reverb around in a 3D space. It's a really, really nice effect. That's not something we're going to get from just the reverb. So combining delays and reverbs can be really, really cool. Now let's hear that in the mix. Yeah, very cool. And hopefully that just gives you some good ideas about bouncing reverbs and delays through each other because there's a lot you can do there. Now, if you remember, our original EQ had a nice low pass at 10K. Now, if we wanted the reverb brighter, we could back this off to 12 or 14K and start letting a little bit more of the airy region of the vocal reverb through. But another great thing to do is to saturate or distort your reverbs. It's an awesome technique because then instead of turning up the reverb or backing off on the EQ, we're going to get a similar effect, but by adding harmonics into the reverb. So after the delay here, the next thing that comes is the exciter. So the exciter is going to add a bunch of harmonics in from 2K and up. So it's also going to get that vocal clarity region of the reverb to start to shimmer a little bit as well. That's also mix dependent. You might want to raise that above that region, and you might also want to raise it above the sibilant region as well, so you're not adding harmonics into the reverb where the sibilance is, but we'll get to that in a second. So listen to the reverb without the exciter, and then we'll turn it on.
Ooh, yeah.
All right, and with the exciter adding high frequency harmonics. Yeah, we've added a nice shimmer and high end to the reverb, but in a way that's doing it with harmonics instead of doing it with EQ. So that's fantastic. So we have distorted the reverb a little bit. And now, since we're adding in extra harmonics and brightening up the high end of the reverb, you can always add a de-esser to your reverb. And this is also really helpful on cymbals and overheads and maybe even on a snare. If you're saturating reverbs and you're adding in extra harmonics and it starts to get a little harsh, you can de-harsh it with a de-esser. And you can start to play around with the presets on the de-esser and find something that works for you. But it's really easy to go back and de-harsh the effects that you've done if it's become a little much in just a few targeted spaces. You could also do the same thing with another EQ, or you could go back to your original EQ and say add another node where maybe the saturation was starting to get harsh. Like say we had a little bit of harshness building up at around 7K, but other than that, we really liked our saturated and distorted reverb. You can go back and sculpt this at the beginning of the chain so there's less there for the saturators to add harmonics to. So that's something else you can always consider. So here's the entire chain with the pre-EQ before the reverb, the sidechain compressor, the stereo delay, the added harmonics from the exciter, and a little bit of de-esser to de-harsh it.
Ooh, yeah.
All right, and in the mix.
Ooh, yeah.
Very nice. Let's go back and listen to it with just the original reverb, which was way too much. Yeah, see, we still have a big 3-second hall reverb, but now we have controlled it and sculpted it just where we want it. Everything back on? Awesome. And like I said, whether you're sending to drums, snares, guitars, whatever it is, there's a lot of neat things that you can do to enhance and sculpt your reverb just how you want it. This works for reverbs, delays. You could also add chorus and flanger to this depending on your content. You could get really creative with this, but you don't just have to slap a reverb on something or a delay. You can combine reverbs and delays and you can sculpt them exactly how you want them and enhance them so you can get the biggest bang for your buck and still not muddy up your mix. Yeah, there's a lot of awesome options there for you. And try different types of saturators. Try tube, try tape, just don't overdo it. But you'll find the right combination of harmonics on the right reverb that just sounds magical and wonderful. You know, every reverb is going to call for a different style of harmonics, and that's all going to be dependent on your mix and your material. But I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that gave you a lot of great ideas. That is the Abbey Road method and beyond. And I will link to some other videos here in the description that I have on these topics. And I'd also like to invite you on over to the Patreon. We do a Q&A over there every week, and we just hit 6 months worth of Q&As. I think we're pushing about 3 hours of material over there. And it's only $5 a month, and you get to support the channel, and you can catch up on a whole bunch of awesome Q&A that's across the board on almost every topic, and then you can chime in and get your questions answered as well. Let me know what you think about all this in the comments, and let me know if there's anything else you want me to tackle, and I catch you all on the next one.